All right, I should be going in just a minute. Now, wanted to talk to you about the idea next in our studies and the fruit of the spirit is self-control. And self-control is a one of those terms that is used in we use it very broadly, and we can also use it very narrowly, right? So this is what sorry, this thing is weird. Okay, so this is about what we can learn from the word. It's only used 3 times in the New Testament. This specific word. The specific word comes from the list in Galatians chapter 5. So we have the fruit of the Spirit, right? It's listed there. It's also listed in Peter's work letter because it also has another list. So it's part of 2 lists. Two of the 3 times it's used is just in a list. And the third one is in Acts chapter 24 and verse 25 when Paul was talking to Felix, and he was reasoning with him about self-control and about the coming judgment of God. And so this is when he was afraid and said, go away, I may have to come back again. But those are the only times the word is actually used. The concept, though, is used extensively in the Bible. There are other words that are used that are translated self-control, but this one specifically is a lot broader. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it just a little bit this morning, so we get a good idea of what we're trying to accomplish, what we're looking for. And we just finished talking about the idea of faithfulness and what that means, and how that it implies not just being faithful in the sense of having faith. That's part of it. And it doesn't mean also just being faithful in the assembly or being in obedience to God's word. There's more to it than that, because we're taking the heart of God and we're applying it. And remember, this is all coming back all the way back to the very beginning when we talk about meekness. We understand who we are in relationship to God, in relationship to other people. And because of that, we are looking at our abilities and how they can be useful for other people. And so last month, we talked about that. We talked about being useful. We also talked about the idea of kindness, the idea that we should be looking for opportunity to express love and express kindness to other people based upon who we are and what our abilities are and that kind of thing. And meekness, looking around for opportunity. And so this is really kind of the next step in this. It's about controlling ourselves. And the word when it's used with Felix, it's about stopping sin. But it's a broader sense than that, though that is part of it. So we all know that Paul has taught extensively in his writings that we should put off the old man and put on the new, right? So it's not just putting off, it's not just stopping sin, it's also adding in these other characteristics, which has really been our focus. I think that as Christians, sometimes we spend too much time talking about what we need to stop doing and not enough time talking about what we should be doing. And that's what I'm trying to correct. And so I've been coming at this list and fruit of the Spirit from that perspective. What can we do to add to our growth, so we can grow, we can know exactly what we should be doing. Also discussed about knowing what we should be doing. It's been a little bit vague, and that's because we all have different places, right? We all have different roles, and we all have different abilities. We all have different talents, things that God has given to us, opportunities to do good. And we also have different functions and roles within the church, within our families, within all kinds of structures like that we have to be careful to search out exactly what we should be doing. So I hesitated to put too much out there about exactly what we should be doing on a daily basis individually, because it very much changes from person to person. Now, there are some very basic ideas, of course, but that's the idea, of course, of study, sharing with people what we believe, sharing the truth with other people, helping people see what they should be doing in order to become a Christian, that kind of thing. But that even those things play out differently in our own lives. So that's why I've been a little bit vague with it, trying to let us all have the opportunity to come up with our own ideas of what we should be doing. And as we get more and more into this in this year, I'm hoping that we can start to galvanize and start to see how we can all work together using our individual abilities and talents, and think, okay, here are all the different opportunities that we have. Here's all the different ways that we can work based upon who we are and our personalities. And let's put them together and see if we can come up with a plan of how we can work together as a team and be even better. That incidentally is part of the reason we're having the different teams that we have, the color teams, red, blue, yellow, and orange, because this is a way for us to practice to be involved in each other's lives and get into a routine of activity, and not just by ourselves, but together, because the acronym team, right? Together, everyone achieves more. There's a synergistic effect that goes into play. Now, we could all individually just go out and do our own thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if we are actually doing our own thing in conjunction and coordination with other people, then that's going to be a very good thing. Now, that's going to be actually multiplied. Our effects will be multiplied. Now, that isn't always easy to do, though, because we have to figure out how to piece those things together like a puzzle, so that we can have the bigger picture. Now, we don't always see what the bigger picture is, but there is one. Now, we have to keep that in mind, because God is the one who has arranged for all these things that we're involved in our lives. God, through his providence, has brought us together. I believe that he's brought us together in this place at this time for a specific reason, and that is that we can be effective. And he's brought the pieces of a puzzle together, and it's up to us, by living out fully our abilities and our opportunities, living in the moment kind of thing, that we can start to arrange those activities so that we can actually present the bigger picture. And that's my hope throughout this year, and hopefully by the end of this year, we'll kind of have a little bit better idea of a game plan for what we can be doing together to make an impact in this community. We'll always have the individual things that we're doing, but we need to be very careful about that, about what we expect from others. One of the things that I've learned is that it's easy for me whenever I sit down and I think about what I should be doing and what I'm practically doing, I'm trying to put in a daily practice. It's easy for me to look around and say, everyone else should be doing this too. But that's not always the case. In fact, a lot of times it's not the case. Now, if you're talking about like Bible reading, sure. But if we're talking about having opportunity and using those opportunities to do good, you're going to have a lot different opportunities than I am. And it's not up to any of us to sit down and say, okay, you're not doing this, so why aren't you doing it? Because you may be doing other things, right? I keep coming back to in the book of Acts in chapter 6, whenever the apostles had the problem with the widows who were being neglected, and they said, okay, choose men who will be able to oversee this, and that they can get that done. So we don't have to wait tables. We can use our abilities and our talents. Their ability was that God gave them, Jesus gave them the Holy Spirit so that they could speak, preach and teach and have full knowledge. It wouldn't make sense for them to serve food to people, which was equally important, but it wouldn't make sense for them to do that and have someone else teach the gospel when they're the ones that had all the knowledge, right? So they all had different functions. And it wasn't that one was more important than the other, but they had specific things that they needed to do based on who they were. I know we all understand that, but that comes into the idea of what we're talking about with self-control. Generally, we talk about self-control. We talk about it in the negative sense, like we see in Acts chapter 24 and verse 25, with he's talking to Felix about that. And it is true that self-control implies that we are controlling ourselves, stopping ourselves from sin. That is the primary use of it. Okay, and that's important. And so we need to think about what it is that we can do to control ourselves. And it's usually used in two different ways in the New Testament. One of them is through the idea of sexuality, that we should exercise self-control in that. That's what self-control is often used for. And the other one is sobriety. It's a different word, but it's the idea of being sober. And specifically, it's used several times to talk about drunkenness. So I mean, several. I mean, most of the time, it's talking about it's either talking about sexuality or drunkenness. Okay, one of the two. But it does have a broader sense. Now, we certainly wouldn't want to say that we could be good in those two things and yet be adulterous, or well, that is sexual immorality. Sorry, that we could be a liar or a thief or something like that. Obviously, self-control relates to all the things, but it also is a word that is more than that. I was reading earlier about this, and I read something good that someone wrote. I'm trying to find out where he is. A man was looking at some of Plato's works, looking at this word, and he was talking about here the idea of self-government. And that's a very good way of putting it. The word actually in the original language, and I'm not an expert, but I just see it in a dictionary and it says this, is literally, it's two words that are put together, the word in and the word power. So it's that is, we're living a life that's in power. That is, we're in control. That's the idea. And that's why that's where we get the idea of self-control. It's not controlling other people. Oh, that's the easy part, right? But it's controlling ourselves. And this is related to an idea that John Ubersachs promoted from his study of Plato that I really thought was good. And that is that this is the idea of managing the different hats that we wear. So think about that for just a second. We all have different hats, right? We all have different titles. I'm a father, I'm a preacher, I'm a son, I'm a citizen of Texas, I'm a citizen of the United States. There's a lot of hats that I wear. And the idea is that I manage all of those different personalities, so to speak, in the proper way. So it's not just about controlling my sinful desires. It's also about managing my life in the best way. So this is a very important idea, a very important term. And it's part of what Paul meant when he was talking about self-control and the judgment to come, but his was more about the sins that he was involved in, that Felix was involved in. But we can use it in the broader sense that we have control over ourselves and we're managing ourselves. And in fact, the word, anytime you see the word that a government word that ends in CRACY, like democracy, plutocracy, there's different cracies out there, right? That cracy at the end is actually the root of what we're talking about. So this is a broader term than just self-control, controlling the passions. There's another thing that was mentioned, I read about this, I thought was fascinating. Proverbs has several things to do to talk about self-control. And it's an interesting topic to me, and because I don't feel like I have yet mastered this, and I'm really working on this. But in Proverbs chapter 25, we have this verse in verse 28. He said, whoever has no rule over his spirit is like a city broken down without walls. Okay, so this is what someone who has no rule over his spirit, he said, is like a city that's broken down with no walls. Now, remember back in those times that the walls represented security. It kept the enemies out, right? And it kept the people inside safe. So if you are someone who has no control or no rule over yourself, then you're like someone who actually has no defenses. Anything that comes in is going to be able to do whatever it wants to do. You have no way of controlling it and no way of stopping it. And when we look at it from that perspective, it really opens it up to me a little bit more. This is the Interpreter's Bible, the Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible. This is a quotation from that. I thought it was really fitting. The picture here is that of a city whose walls have been so nearly destroyed as to be without defense against an enemy. So is the man who has no restraint over his spirit, the source of man's passionate energies. He has no defense against anger, lust, and the other unbridled emotions that destroy the personality. So if we think of it as outside forces being able to come in, it's not that we automatically have sinful things or sinful desires that within us. When we were created, we didn't have sinful desires, but we learned over time through watching our parents or watching people around us or just experimentation. What can I do in this situation? We have certain things that will naturally crop up because that's human nature, right? That not that we're sinful, but that we have emotions, and we have things that jump in on us, right? And if we're not ready if we can't control ourselves, we don't have a good handle on how to live our lives, self-mastery, those things, when they enter our hearts and we enter our thoughts, can be expressed without us having any control over them. Another passage to consider about this is James chapter 3, because he talks in here about the difference, the contrast between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. And you can also see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. He contrasts the wisdom of the world and what he calls the foolishness of God, which is the way it seems to the world, because worldly wisdom doesn't seem wise, but it is. So in James chapter 3, verse 13, he says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." So if we are truly wise, and our wisdom is from above, then we will demonstrate that in the way we behave. Okay, so that's the idea of having self-control that I wanted to bring out this morning, because this month starts that process of thinking about it. And I hope you'll think about it as we go through the week and through the month, how we can learn to have better self-control. And I'm going to talk about that from a perspective of getting rid of sin, but also a perspective of managing our lives and the various components of our lives. So as a Christian, it's important for us to have control over our money. It's important for us to have control over our time. It's important for us to be good citizens. It's important for us to wear all the different hats in the best way possible. And when we do that, we have to make a lot of difficult decisions, don't we? We have to make decisions about balance, about priorities. Again, it keeps coming back to what we've been talking about and building toward so far all this year, that we understand who we are, that we understand what our function is, what our role is, and now we're starting to see how we manage that so that we have the best opportunities to grow and to not be a hindrance to the growth of the church, and also that we can grow ourselves. So that's what management is all about. And it in a way, it relates to what we're going to talk about in Mark chapter 6. So if you want to turn there with me, Mark chapter 6 is going to be, we've just finished where he fed the 5,000, and then he walks on the sea. Jesus walks on the sea to them while they're in the boats. And remember, the storm was on the water, and Jesus was off on a mountain praying, and he saw them, and straining at the oars. So he's going to go walk right by them. And they saw him, and they thought it was a ghost. So Jesus said, "It's tide, do not be afraid." And so he came onto the boat, and they then immediately made it to the other side. So this is where we are in Mark chapter 6. And in verse 53, it says, "When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there." Now, we've been here before with them, right? So they came here, and this is where they found, does anyone remember? It's the man that had the many demons inside, the legion within. Now, this is the demoniac, is what some people call it. And that's where all the evil spirits went into the swine, and they ran off the cliff. Remember the response of the people that were there when he was there the first time was they asked him to leave because they were afraid of him. And they saw the man who's sitting in his right mind, but they were still afraid because of the swine that killed themselves. And so they said, you need to go. And he left, but he came back. Hey, doesn't that say something? That no doesn't always mean no forever. But sometimes we write people off, right? We're not going to try again. I tried once. I invited them to church once, and they said no. So I'm never going to do it again. I'm glad that people didn't have that attitude with me and other people that I know. That although it is easy to have it, isn't it? It's easy for us to look around and say, I don't like rejection, and if I talk to this person, I'm probably going to see some rejection. So I'm not even going to try. We've got to learn to have a little bit thicker skin when it comes to that. But Jesus understood that no doesn't always mean no forever. So he went back, and he's going to go back now. And it says, here's a completely different response. Oh, when he left the first time, remember, the man that had the demons, he wanted to go with Jesus. And Jesus said, no, you go around and you tell everybody what God has done for you and the kindness that God has shown to you. So now whenever he comes back in verse 54, it says, when they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him, ran through the whole surrounding region, and began to carry about on beds those who were sick to wherever they heard he was. What a difference of reaction. There is only one explanation for that reaction. That demoniac did a lot of work. That man who was possessed did a lot of work. He talked to a lot of people. Jesus told him, go and tell everybody what you heard, what's happened to you. Now, most of the people, if they didn't recognize the man, they knew of the man, right? You don't have a man in your area who walks around, who's in a cemetery, he walks around cutting himself and crying out. You don't have that kind of man in an area and people not talk about him, right? This guy was probably the stuff of legend. I imagine that kids would sit around campfires and tell each other stories about this man coming to kill them. I mean, I can imagine all kinds of things being said because this was an extremely strange situation. So when that man comes up to you in right mind and says, that was true. I was that way. And look who I am now. You think that's going to make an impact? It absolutely did. Never underestimate the ability of God to work through you. Okay, so if we are going to share with people what has happened to us, how we've changed, people should be able to see that, first of all. But if we will explain the change, this is where God is going to get the glory. He's going to get the credit for it. And as a result, people will start to look for him for help, right? So if we credit our changes in our lives with, well, I've just grown up, or I've finally matured, or I've finally figured things out, or, those kinds of things, instead of saying, well, God has helped me through these situations, we're missing an opportunity to actually make an impact on other people. We've kind of shied away from this in the church. And I think in a sense, it's been reactionary because of being overdone. Just because somebody claims that God did something for them doesn't mean that it actually happened. There's no proof of that. There's no way that that's evidence. But if we're talking to people and they see a difference in our lives and we tell them how that difference came about, it's very difficult for them to argue with the source, right? It's difficult for them to say, no, it didn't happen that way, if they see a change in our lives, right? But if they don't see a change in our lives, then it's really not that much of an effect. This is where we can have an impact on our family and on our friends. Because strangers, they don't know us. They don't know what we used to be, right? Unless you're like this man who everybody knew. But they probably don't know who you are. They probably don't know what you used to be like. And so they see you right now as you are. But your family and friends should see a difference, right? Because if you were a Christian, that means that you were living before a life that was not in accordance with God's word. And it is possible that you hid a lot of things. And so they may not have understood how bad you were, but they still should see some kind of a difference in your life. And that's going to be because of our relationship with God. So this is what kind of an impact that we can have, and we can share this with other people. It's a way for us to have an opportunity to have a better discussion about the Bible. That's the way I see it. So the personal things that have happened to us, the growth that we've experienced, or the joy that we now have, or whatever it is, however we want to approach it, is not an end of itself. It's an opportunity. It's a window, perhaps, into someone else's lives. I've learned that we have to be able to relate to other people, and people have to be able to relate to us for them to listen to us. Have you learned that? I think that if you think about it, people relate to people based upon similarities. And if we are going to help other people, we're going to have to be able to relate to them, and they're going to have to be able to relate to us. They're going to have to be able to open up a little bit and think, okay, you're like me in some way. It's those likenesses, it's those shared characteristics that help us build trust with each other. If we never discuss those kinds of things, then they won't know about that connection that they have. So it's okay for us to talk about some of the problems we've had in the past, or some of the difficulties that we've had, because what it does is it opens us up to other people where they can connect in the same place and say to themselves, I think I can relate to that, right? I've been there. If they can say that I've been there, and when you're telling your past, then you have a connection with them. And that connection means that you're building trust. And building trust really is the basis for movement toward God in a better way. All right. Now, obviously, if they are ready to hear the gospel, you can teach them what God says. You tell them exactly what God says. You don't actually have to have that kind of connection. They may have a connection with God already, but if you're dealing with people who you're trying to reach and you have no idea where to start, a good place to start is how you've been affected, how you've been changed. And so that may be you're trying to help feel a need there that someone might have, and you can connect with people in that way. So I can imagine that this man really impacted a lot of people, and I can imagine that because of the reaction that they had, right? And they're pulling people from all over the place, the whole surrounding region. They came and began to carry about on beds those who were sick to wherever they heard he was. And in verse 56, the last verse of the chapter, whenever he entered into villages, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched him were made well. So here again, just touching Jesus was all that it took for them to be healed. So imagine now, if you want to apply this to self-control, you can easily see how, although we're talking about differences because this man who had the demons, we're talking about a supernatural event that occurred with him and supernatural problems of demon possession. But if you can see the contrast there, that should be a contrast that people see in our lives as well. We were this way. And so I can relate in a sense to what the demoniac was going through, because he definitely lived a disheveled life, right? He definitely lived a life that was horrible. And in many ways, he was mentally imbalanced, and all kinds of problems that he faced. And it's because of these demons. And then now we have the after picture where he is demonstrating that he is in his right mind. I think the implication there is that he had full control over himself again, finally. And if that's the huge contrast that caused such an excitement for other people, perhaps we also can relate to that as well, as far as when we clean up our own lives and we start living as we should and having that self-control, that this is something that it can be appealing to other people. Now, I think part of this is age, and part of it is, maturity, that kind of thing. But there is a part of this that is because of the training and the the power that comes from being closer to God. Because I've known people who were elderly who didn't have self-control, and you have too, right? Who didn't have the ability to control and manage themselves well. And that's not always easy for us to do. And younger people have, I know I did, and I still struggle, but I used to think all the time, I just need to learn how to control myself, to manage myself, right? I need to learn how to do these different things, all these different areas that we live in. So I'm an employee, all the different hats that we wear that I mentioned before. And when you're a young person and you're just, for example, you're just getting married or you're just starting to have children, your life is really starting to bloom, but you're still in the newer stages of it. Man, I felt like I was faking so much. Didn't you? Did you feel like you had it all under control? I remember thinking so many times of people when we first got married. I'd look at people who were older and had been married for longer, and that I could see them. Wow, they really have things there. They're on the ball, right? They have it all worked out. And then I got to be their age, and I realized they didn't really have it worked out, but they sure looked like they did. But this is a growth process. We can actually help people who are younger or who have less experience or just have a hard time controlling themselves and teaching them. And we're going to do that really through helping them learn. And a great place to learn would be like, for example, the book of Proverbs. Really just getting into the Bible can really help change people's lives. But also, we need to recognize that sin is involved in there too. We have to learn how to help people get through the sin and stop with the sin. Sometimes it's very difficult. It gets a hold of them and doesn't want to let them go. And so we have to be able to have some compassion and help them through that. All right, does anyone have any comments or questions? Because we're going to get into chapter 7 unless somebody wants to bring something up. I can't actually see but like a couple of you, so I don't know, but I'm going to assume everything's fine. Okay, so chapter 7 of Mark. The Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to Jesus, having come from Jerusalem. Now, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, with unwashed hands, they found fault. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding to the tradition of the elders. Let's see here. The special way in verse 3, the footnote says, literally with a fist. And we don't really know exactly what that means, but scholars have come to the conclusion that they meant that was some kind of a ceremonial washing. And yeah.
It says up to the elbows.
McCord's translation says up to the elbows. And that's probably true, because I know that we say hand and we mean from the wrist up or the wrist down to the fingers, right? But in the original language in Greek, they meant the hand was like this. That's the hand. So you wash your hands. So it could be that they had to have it go to a certain depth when they're dunking their hands under the water. Interesting, the word wash is baptizo, which means to immerse. So it's not just getting their hands wet. They really went in and washed themselves. We know that obviously today we wash our hands, right? We wash our hands a lot right now. But this was not the same kind of cleansing. It certainly would have been okay for them to say, your hands are dirty. Why don't you wash your hands? I'm sure that if the apostles felt like their hands were dirty, they would have washed their hands. But this was a ceremonial cleansing that they didn't do. And so this is something that the leading Jews, the Jews in power, imposed on other people and said, this is what should be done. By the way, there are no laws in the Old Testament that require hand washing like this. It's most likely related to the idea of ceremonially cleansing their hands, which really brings up an interesting thing, because if their hands were unclean, that meant their body was unclean. If their body was unclean, and it prevented them from eating, which the law of Moses didn't do, but if it did, they would have had to cleanse their body and not just their hands. But for some reason, they came to the conclusion that if you just wash your hands, everything will be okay. So they did this. And it's an interesting thing. It says in verse 4, when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Now, not like the couch that I'm sitting on. These would have been very different couches, but still, that would have been a process. That would have been difficult to manage. And some translations or some translations don't actually have that in there. It's one of those what they call a disputed text. But I think it fits. Certainly something that seems like the Pharisees would require of other people. The Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" He answered and said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups, and many other such things you do." He said to them, "All too well you reject the commandment of God, that you may keep your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death.' But you say, if a man says to his father or mother, 'Whatever profit you might have received from me is Corban, that is, a gift to God,' then you no longer let him do anything for his father or his mother, making the word of God of no effect through your tradition which you have handed down, and many such things you do." All right, so we're going to stop there. But this is a rebuke. Jesus is being rebuked because his disciples didn't wash hands, and Jesus turns it back on them, right? And says, you are ones who have created tradition that actually nullify God's word. Now, tradition in and of itself is not wrong. It's not wrong for us to have habits or tradition. I once knew a man who believed that all tradition was wrong because of passages like this. And so every time he would get up and lead singing, he would intentionally do it in different ways. He would lead a lot of different songs. And we always have a kind of a set pattern. This is the way we do things. And he couldn't stand that. So sometimes he would lead from the floor. Sometimes he would do it on the pulpit. He would just change it up. And he did that because he said, "I don't want to create a habit. I don't want to create a tradition." Well, I'm not saying that was wrong, but I think it was a misunderstanding. It's okay to have some traditions. We also know that there are traditions, what we call the traditions of the elders, or traditions of the apostles. The apostles had traditions that they established. They were from Jesus. The Lord's Supper is one of those traditions, right? Every Sunday we meet together, and we have for 2,000 years. We come together to remember the death of Jesus in the Lord's Supper. That's just an example. But there is a problem whenever we have traditions. Two things we have to be careful of. One, that we don't demand people to follow our tradition, whatever, unless it's from God, right? We don't want to create a tradition and require everyone else to do it, and all of a sudden we start looking at them suspect because they're not doing what we think we should. This is exactly what happened in Mark chapter 7. It's possible that this started off as simply a good idea. Someone had a good idea. I think maybe it might be a good idea if I would wash my hands just to make sure I don't have anything on me that's unclean when I eat this food and enter my body. It's possible. I don't know where it started. I know a lot of good things a lot of bad things started off with good intentions. But whatever the case, at this point, it wasn't something that was good, because they were actually condemning the apostles for not doing what they required of them because of a tradition. And Jesus didn't forbid, he wouldn't tell them not to wash their hands, but he didn't require it either, because this was their decision that they get to make. We need to be careful with that we are not, the way that we do things it's not written in stone. And I know we all understand that, but sometimes it's easy for us to forget, or maybe I should say sometimes it's difficult for us to know the difference between what is required by God and what is a traditional way of obeying that requirement. And we have to be careful with that. A good illustration I think I've used before was when I first started the work. We had a Monday night meeting that we started. It was someone's idea, and we decided, okay, we'll try it, see what happens. And it went really well. We just got together every Monday, and we'd write cards to people who were missing, or we'd try to figure out who we can visit. We called it Monday Night for the Master. It was wonderful. But the problem was that only about half the congregation participated, which really wasn't a problem, but it became a problem. Because after about 3 months, I noticed that people were kind of sitting around going, well, where's so-and-so? Why is it only half the people show up? Where's the other half? And then it became it started becoming like a gripe session. And then it started becoming like an indictment on the people that weren't there. And I even remember one person actually asking, I wonder if they're even faithful if they're not here, because they ought to be here. And that would really bothered me, because 3 months before, these people were considered faithful to God. But because now this group started their own thing, they started looking around and saying, well, the people that aren't doing what we're doing, you see what I'm saying? If you're not doing what we're doing, then you must not be faithful to God. That comes back again, full circle, what I've started off this lesson with this morning, that we need to be careful not to impose on other people the things that we are doing and suppose that everyone else has to do it the same way that we are, because that's not right. Evangelism is a very good way of looking at that. I used to be this way. I used to look at people and say, you're not outdoor knocking with me, then I don't even know if you're even faithful to God. I remember thinking things like it, very frustrated with people because I couldn't get them to do anything. Well, little did I know what they were doing behind the scenes. I don't know what they were doing. So I was making judgments. It's very possible that they were talking to people, and I might never known it. And you say, well, they weren't very effective. I wasn't very effective either. I mean, if they were effective, I would know it, right? Because you'd see the results. I wasn't very effective either. I've knocked thousands and thousands. I added it up one day, and it was well over 10,000 doors that I've knocked on or hung things on in my lifetime. I have been very active in that. I have not seen a baptism from it. Does that mean that it's wrong to do? No. And maybe there are other people that are a whole lot better at it than I am. But what I'm saying is I didn't see any results of mine either. Somebody, unless I told them, they wouldn't even know I was doing it, right? So there are other people that are doing things behind the scenes that we need to be careful not to assume that because they're not doing what we're doing, that they're not doing anything. That's an example of that. But here in this case, we need to be very careful and cautious about what it is that we bind on other people, right? So we can have opinions about everything, but when we start binding an opinion on others, we've crossed a line. I bind certain things perhaps in my house, in my life, that I wouldn't say are necessarily scriptural as far as required by God, but these are things that I believe are best. But I can't bind that on other people and say, you have to be this way and do these certain things, because we're all different. And as long as we're not violating scripture, as long as we're living in accordance with the scripture, then we need to let people be. And so that's something that's, we all know, we all talk about it, we all love to harp on that, but it's really hard for us to see it when we do it. I know that from experience. So we have to keep thinking about it, right? What is it that we can do to make sure we're not this way? He called them hypocrites in verse 7. He says, in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. See, that's the other part of this. There's one part that says, do not bind it on other people just because it's your opinion. And the second part is, we better not have any traditions that actually will violate God's word. And that's what they were doing. They set themselves up with this idea of Corban. And this will be the last thought with this, we run out of time. But the idea of Corban was that if you would give your money to the temple, then we'll let you off the hook as far as giving money to your parents, because the law said that they had to honor their father and mother. And because they had to honor their father and mother, part of that meant that they helped support them, especially as they aged. This was a requirement. Honoring your father and mother wasn't just paying respect to them. It was paying respect in helping them in their hard years, in their difficult years, as they aged. Honoring your father and mother meant that you're taking care of them. So the people, the priests and the leaders of Israel, for some reason, decided if you're giving that money to God, then that's a higher priority, and you don't have to give any money to your parents. And people were using that also as a loophole, from what I understand. So they were pledging it to the temple and withholding it from their family, but they weren't necessarily even giving it to God. But even if they did, that's not right, because we have to support our families. And so Jesus is saying, you honor people this way because you see them as great benefactors for the work of God, because they're giving of their means, and yet they're neglecting family to do it. And you're okay with that. You're promoting that. You're accepting that, and that's wrong. And they had so many things mixed up, right? Their priorities were out of whack, as if God needs extra money, right? um, God doesn't need your money. God doesn't need our money. I don't think we should be out looking at doing lessons on encouraging people to give more. However, God needs us to be generous. So that's why we give. It's a giving from the heart, a giving because I have the money, I have the funds, and this is what I choose to do with it because I love God and I want to see things happen. So that's a very different approach. All right, I need to stop there because we got about 10 minutes till worship time. We need to get some stuff together. Anybody have any comments or questions before we stop? Okay. Well, I'm going to stop the YouTube